Once again, I'm with Paula Gooder, and we're talking about aspects of healing. Paula, last time we were talking about prayer for healing and some of the models and patterns there. What we didn't really touch on was precisely what it is we might be praying for when, as a church, we pray for healing. When we come to our intercessions, what are we praying for? We talked in an earlier session about how we acknowledge that actually healing as we expected may not come. Paul had his thorn in the flesh, which he prayed about 3 times, asked it to be taken away. So what are we praying for when we pray for healing?
Well, the obvious answer is healing. But we need to remember this is the 5th week of a 5-week course, and remember that actually healing is so much bigger than we get our heads around.
Yes.
And one of the real challenges, I think, is we ask for this specific thing that we want. And so often you discover in the gospel accounts that people get far, far more than they bargained for. They come to Jesus for healing and go away being healed, but also with their sins forgiven, which they hadn't occurred to them to ask for. And so the recognition that we need to hold in our minds when we're thinking about healing is that it is right to ask for specific things, but also we need to bear in mind that we may go away having received something that we never expected and never bargained for, with our original plea unanswered, but with so much more in other areas. I think one of the real challenges is the ability to be able to think sideways and to recognise where healing has happened, even when it's not the thing we wanted healing from.
And that's part, presumably, just about what we believe about God and God's graciousness and hugeness and generosity, that having come to God in prayer, and we were talking about how prayer is about expressing our relationship with God, actually what then may happen is bigger and richer and fuller than anything we had in our mind when we came to God in prayer in the first place.
Indeed. But also we need to bear in mind that sometimes we go away unable to see how there is an answer to prayer. And we need just to be clear that that also happens. That you come and you pray with everything that you have, and you believe that God can heal you, and you go away and you can't see an answer.
And there are whole strands and themes of Christian spirituality down the centuries which have kind of wrestled with that, aren't there? Where people are having to work out why that might be.
Indeed so. And the one thing that we need to remind ourselves of is that prayer isn't a shopping list. We can't submit our internet prayer order to God and God comes and says you can't have items 3 and 4 but you can have the rest of your order. That's not what prayer is about. Yes. And so although God does like us to pray and to pray for specific issues and pray with focus and clarity, that is not the guarantee that God will necessarily respond in the way that we wish. But as you said earlier, God is a God of generosity and graciousness. And you can be sure that the God of generosity and graciousness will give to you far more than you imagined. The challenge is often being able to recognise what that is.
Now, these things we've been talking about the God who's generous, who's gracious, we've talked about fullness of life, we've talked about healing, we've talked about forgiveness. These are tremendous things which, in a sense, we're able to offer.
Yes.
And therefore the thought comes, our church communities presumably are intended to be there in part as communities which hold out this offer to others of all this which is encompassed within our ideas of healing and wholeness and salvation and restoration. I have this feeling that a lot of people out there don't really see the church in that way. They might go to their health centre because they want to see their doctor, but they probably wouldn't walk through the doors of their church expecting all of this that we're talking about.
Indeed not. And that is why one of the really important callings of the church is actually not to stay within the doors, because people don't necessarily come to the church expecting to have the issues that they want. But one of the things we who are Christians know is that God is so generous and so gracious and so giving that he pours out and it flows outwards. But how will people know that if we don't actually open the doors and go out to them?
So things like the Healing on Streets movement and things like that, and offering opportunities for people to come who perhaps are vulnerable in communities and in society, all that's part of the healing ministry?
I would say all of it is. One of my favourite passages in 1 Corinthians 15 that we looked at earlier in this course is the reference to the difference between Adam and Christ. 1 Corinthians 15 makes very clear that Adam is someone who receives life. He was a living being. God gave him life and he came alive. The difference between him and Jesus is that Paul says Jesus is a life-making being. So he didn't receive life, he made life. And so when can you know that Christ is present? You know Christ is present when there is life, when life begins to spring forth. And one of the wonderful experience of being in a local church is to see the extraordinary ways in which life springs forth in all sorts of parts of the church's life.
And often that's actually in quite low-key ways, isn't it? I mean, when the bereaved person becomes part of the life of the church community and discovers life beyond and through their bereavement, when the person who's struggling with mental health issues finds that the church is actually a place where they can belong, where nowhere else has been that. All those are for instances, which are often do with relatedness, actually, aren't they?
They are, indeed. And it is when there is relationship reformed and nurtured and loved between individuals and communities that you begin to see life springing forth. And so for me, one of the kind of the markers of a healing church is it is a place, a community in which relationships are formed, in which love flowers, and in which community grows and grows beyond all imagining.
Right back towards the beginning of this course, we referred to that phrase which appears in Ezekiel and in Revelation about healing and the leaves of the trees, and in Revelation the rider healing for the nations. Well, it may not be nations, but we're talking about the church in local settings, in its communities. Is that an application of that verse, that actually we're trying to make that real, the rivers of living water and so forth, the tree which is for the healing of the nations and of peoples?
Yes, and if we remind ourselves, that is the tree of life.
Yeah.
So it's the tree of life which goes constantly outwards, looking for people, places, situations, relationships that it can heal and bring to new life again.
So our local church communities could see themselves, in terms of that image, as it were, a branch of that tree called upon to grow those leaves of healing within the particular place where they are.
Absolutely, in all sorts of different forms and ways. And one of the things I often wonder is whether we as a church generally need to become better at telling our stories of the healing that we have seen in our communities, just so that it makes other people realise, not necessarily people outside the church, but those of us within the church realise actually how broad and wide and different the healing is that takes place when churches are bringing to life in our communities.
I think that might be a place to end, with that challenge to our churches, our congregations, to ourselves, to realise the magnificence and wonder of that which is entrusted to us, and to ask ourselves how effectively we hold out that gift of healing and life. Thank you.